AARP Texas, and I am pleased that AARP is a proud sponsor of the Striking a Balance Caregiver Conference. As a sponsor, we hope that you are gaining new insights into family caregiving and that you have the opportunity to connect with other caregivers and experts on aging. Family caregiving is a priority for AARP. It is essential to our work today, but that's not all. AARP is doing amazing things to make life better for the age 50+ populations and the generations to follow. We help improve their financial well-being and their health. We want people to contribute to society and local communities and to fully enjoy life. Some of you may already know that AARP has a strong presence throughout Texas in many communities in this great state, including Austin, the capital city where I live and work. Again, this year, AARP Texas is bringing opportunities to our members and others through virtual events, just like this one that we're participating in today. We hope you have the opportunity to enjoy these free offerings. Not only are there programs to help unpaid family caregivers, but there are presentations to help people avoid being victims of fraud. We host fitness seminars and we work with city leaders towards making this an even more age-friendly community. And know this, volunteers are critical for our mission. There are many opportunities for those who can give a little time to volunteer. You can learn more about these local happenings at aarp.org/TX or find us at the AARP Texas Facebook page. But again, of course, family caregiving is a priority. There are 48 million family caregivers in the US, 3.4 million in Texas alone. They provide help to loved ones, usually a parent, spouse, or sibling. Caregiving can be anything from driving a loved one to a doctor's appointment, making sure bills are paid, cleaning the house, or helping bathe and dress. And many caregivers do fairly complex medical tasks. Caregivers come from every generation, from Gen Z to the silent generation, and every racial and ethnic group. And you know, most of us will either be a caregiver or need care at some point during our lives. AARP recently released new research on how much family caregivers spend out of their own pockets to care for a loved one. We found that almost every caregiver spends money on caregiving, and about 8 in 10 routinely spend their own money on caregiving. The average amount that caregivers spend each year is $7,240. That's more than a fourth of their household income on average. Housing expenses like rent or mortgage payments, assisted living, and home modifications make up more than half of caregiver spending, followed by medical expenses. Caregivers also experience indirect financial setbacks, often postponing their own personal savings for retirement. But I am here to tell you there's action that can help. Congress is considering a bipartisan bill called the Credit for Caring Act, which would create a tax credit of up to $5,000 for working family caregivers. This could help offset some of those major expenses that we know caregivers are facing. AARP, along with 80 other organizations, endorse the Credit for Caring Act. Family caregivers are the backbone of our long-term care system, but they are breaking under the pressure. Creating a tax credit for family caregivers is one way that Congress can help. If you would like to learn more about the Credit for Caring Act, visit aarp.org/caregiving. There, you will also find many resources available for family caregivers just like you. So again, that's aarp.org/caregiving. Thank you for listening. Again, I'm Jessica Lemon with AARP Texas, and thank you for all that you do as family caregivers or to support caregivers.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you for joining us, and welcome to our 20th anniversary of the Striking a Balance Caregiver Conference. My name is Rob Fabian with Age of Central Texas, and along with the Area Agency on Aging of the Capital Area, we are very proud to be your co-host for the 20th year of this amazing conference. You know, this is the largest and longest running Caregiver Conference in Central Texas, and we are so glad that you are a part of it this year. We have 6 amazing presentations for you this week, starting this morning with Dr. Barry Jacobs, who is a longtime friend for all of us here in Central Texas. So we're glad that he is joining us once again. Before we get started this morning, let's go over just a few very simple housekeeping issues. Number 1 is that we are recording this session. So if for any reason you have a technical issue or you need to leave early today, don't worry. We're recording the session and it will be available on YouTube later this week, and we will send you that link. Number 2, we sent you a link to the program for this year. Take a look at that, because not only does it have information on all of our speakers and our wonderful sponsors, but it also has a lot of caregiver resources that we pulled together for you. So be sure and take a look at that. Then finally, we have a chat feature we want you to use today. It's right down here at the bottom of your screen, and it looks kind of like one of those thought bubbles that you see in the comic strips. Click on that and it'll open up the chat box. And while Barry is doing his presentation, we want you to talk back to us. Send us your questions. Barry's going to ask some questions of you during his presentation and want you to answer them. But remember, this time is for you. This is why we do this every year, is to bring you these amazing experts who can bring you the best information there is out there on caregiving. So be sure and ask your questions, because this is your chance to have all of those answered. Then at the end of this week, also watch your emails, because we're going to send you a survey. And we ask you that you take about 2 minutes to fill out the online survey for us, because it's going to help us plan for next year. In fact, all of the sessions that we put together for you this year were based off of surveys from last year's conferences. So be sure and answer those surveys, because we need to hear from you. We want to know where you are in your journey. What are some of the issues that you are having, so that next year we can bring the experts back again to help you in your journey. That's it. It is my pleasure to introduce Patty Boardy. She is the director at the Area Agency on Aging of the Capital Area, and she is going to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Rob. I am super excited to be here. Those of you who have been coming as repeat attendees are familiar with me. I was there at the very first one. I am so proud and pleased to be here at the 20th anniversary. It has been quite a journey. We have learned quite a lot, and we could not bring you the quality programs that we have brought every year without the support of our speakers, our outside professionals, our contacts, our colleagues, our family members. We learn as much from you as family members and caregivers as we do from our professional colleagues. So as Rob said, please do not hesitate to speak up, give us your input, get in that chat box, and really get as much out of today as you can. Barry Jacobs has been a colleague of ours for quite some time. He's been working in the field of family caregiving for probably longer than 20 years, was there right at the foundation of the ideas of how do we support these family caregivers. So we have relied on him over the course of this event to really help support and educate. He's also been a great colleague in that he's very nimble and flexible. And this year when we asked him, do you think you could speak a little bit about the history? He said, of course I could, no problem. So you are in for a real treat, because not only are you going to get great information about caregiver compassion and self-care, but you're going to learn a little bit about some of this journey and where we were 20 years ago and where we hope to go in the future. Those of you who have heard Barry before, you know what you're in for, and you know you're in for a treat. And those of you who have not, welcome. We're so happy to bring in new people to learn from Barry and learn from others. Without further ado, Barry Jacobs is a clinical psychologist, a family therapist, and a principal at the Philadelphia Office of Health Management Associates, a national healthcare consulting firm. A former journalist, he is the author of the Emotional Survival Guide for Caregivers and co-author of the AARP Meditations for Caregivers and the just released AARP Love and Meaning After 50. He also writes a monthly self-help column for family caregivers on aarp.org. He is the national spokesperson on family caregiving for the American Heart Association and an honorary board member of the Well Spouse Association. And we are so happy to also call Barry, our longtime friend. So welcome, Barry. And you're all in for a treat. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Patty. Thank you, Area Agency on Aging of Capital Area. Thank you, Age of Central Texas and Rob, and thank you, AARP Texas. And thank all of you for being here today. And really is a privilege for me to be joining you to celebrate this 20th anniversary, which I think is a real milestone. When I hear Patty say that, I was there at the beginning, and it's true, I think I gave my first presentation on family caregiving in 1988. So what that means is I'm an old guy. And one of the nice things about being an old guy is that I have the perspective of seeing just how much progress we've made over the years. So let me share my slides and we can get going. And just for those of you who haven't seen me speak before, I try to make this as interactive as possible. It's a little tougher on Zoom than it might be if I were in a room with you, but I think we'll make the best use of the chat box we can. I'm going to ask you lots of questions. I'm going to try to make this as much of a conversation as possible, because the truth is I learn as much from you as you learn from me, and you'll learn more from each other just reading what's in the chat box, and you'll learn from me. So let's see what we can do making the best use of this technology. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll take a look at my slide deck. Okay, hoping that's visible for everybody. So today's topic is as Patty said, practicing self-care, and we're going to look at it from a historical perspective. What was going on in the 80s and 70s? What's going on now? How are family caregivers taking care of themselves now, and how might family caregivers fare in the future? All right. And what we're going to go over is I'm going to do a real quick historical tour of family caregiving and self-care, and then we're going to settle into talking a little bit about what I consider to be some of the keys for caregiver self-care. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we overcome what I have decided to call support hesitancy. I'm sure you've heard of vaccine hesitancy, but we're talking today about support hesitancy among family caregivers, and we'll talk a little bit about the future. And I do know that later on in this series of talks for the 20th anniversary, Bob Stephen of AARP is going to be talking also about the future of family caregiving in greater depth. So let me ask you some questions, just so I can get a better sense of who's here today. And I'd love it if you would use the chat box. So 3 questions: who are you caring for? Whether they're a parent, a spouse, a friend. What is their diagnosis? Because I'm assuming that many of them have either a medical diagnosis or some other condition that requires them to have care. And how many years have you been a family caregiver? If you could put that right in the chat box, I'll take a look at them, and then Rhonda from Age is going to help me a little bit. All right, and I'm seeing some answers in here. I'm just going to. And Tom Blair says, taking care of a spouse with Alzheimer's, been doing it for 2 years. Karen says, taking care of a parent. Carol, spouse, Alzheimer's, 10 years. Carol, you're a veteran who's got a lot of knowledge that we hope we can draw on. Deborah, parent, Alzheimer's, 3 years. Caring for mother, vascular dementia, 11 years. Wow. Mom, many issues, been doing this for 2 years now. Parent, no formal diagnosis, but mild dementia. Okay, so what I'm seeing is we have a variety of folks. Many of you are taking care of either a spouse or a parent, and a large number of you are taking care of folks with one form of dementia or another. And that some of you are fairly new. I saw 8 months at doing this, and then I just see here 13 years from Lynn. It is a long time to be a caregiver, Lynn, and I see Leslie caring for her mom with Alzheimer's, 13 years as well. So those of you who've been at this a long time, let's draw on your knowledge. I mean, you are a fountain of wisdom about caregiving. Roger here has been caring for friends for over 20 years with cancer and HIV/AIDS. there's a lot of folks here with a lot of experience, and that's a resource we want to draw on. All right, I'm not going to have a chance to take a look at them, all of them, but I'm hoping that that you'll, as I'm talking, you'll scroll through and get a better sense of who else is here and what their experiences are. All right, now I have a second set of questions for you, and that is, on a scale of 1 to 10, in which 1 is very low and 10 is very high, how stressful has your caregiving experience been? I just want you to put down a number, 1 to 10. 1 would be maybe no stress at all, and 10 would be extremely stressed. And then the second thing is, what are your favorite ways of taking care of yourself? And I already see folks are right to it. And I'm just going to read them quickly. Elizabeth, I'm sorry to hear it. You're a 10. Lisa's an 8. Betsy's a 10 plus. Oh my. Ina's a 6 right now. Christelia is an 8. Riley's is a 6 in exercise. Loretta is a 10. Betsy, hot bubble bath. Ooh, love that, Betsy. I see 8s. I see 5s. I haven't seen anybody below a 5 yet. Deborah, 7 in golf, exercise, 8. This is one of the most, Lynn says, one of the most difficult things I have done in my life, prayer, contact with friends. Thank you very much. Lynn says 4 at first, 2 now. Oh, excellent, Lynn. So you've learned something along the way to make things better for yourself. Would love to hear what that is. Marie says 6. Betsy says hot tea. I would say hot tea with lots of honey. I would agree with you on that. Jay Lee says 7, Bible study and bridge, supportive friends. Excellent. Terrific. What a wonderful set of ideas about caring for yourself. And what I love to see is that all of you have something that you're doing to care for yourself, which as we'll talk about is not always true for everybody. Sometimes our caregivers are a little bit neglectful, a little bit self-neglectful, I should say. Anyhow, so I'm glad to see that all of you have, as Carol does here, multiple ways of caring for herself: exercise, sleep, cleaning hair, doing small favors for neighbors. But that a number of you are fairly stressed. And when I see someone write 10 plus or 10, it makes me concerned. So what I would say to you is you are in the right place here. Good. All of this is very helpful information to just give me a sense of who you are. And what I've learned is that you're a seasoned bunch, that you know your way around caregiving a bit. So let me share some of my own personal story about caregiving as by way of setting a historical context for you. So this is a photograph from 1942. It's a photograph of my dad when he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and where I live currently. And here he's at a dance with my grandmother. And if you can see the expression on my grandmother's face, she's glowing because my dad was the oldest son in the family. He was her favorite by far, the apple of her eye, the guy she doted on her whole life. And so that when my dad went off to World War II, and I think I have a photograph of my dad in his Air Force uniform, I do not. But when my dad went off in 1942 to fight in the war, he literally sent my grandmother and grandfather a postcard every single day he was in the war. I have just stacks of postcards from different places that he was stationed in over a 4-year period. But then when he came back from the war, he moved back into my grandparents' apartment in Queens, New York, where he then stayed for about 10 years with my grandmother waiting on him hand and foot. And then finally, in 1957, my dad gets his act together and decides, heck, maybe it's time for him to go out and have his own family. So here he is on his wedding day, and there he is in the snazzy white tuxedo on the left. And there's my mom in the lovely white taffeta dress on the right. And there's my grandmother in between them, which is where she often liked to be in their relationship throughout my dad's life. So my grandmother tended to compete with my mom for my dad's attention and his affection. And my mom, I would say, kind of put up with my grandmother. They weren't especially close, but My grandmother was a very domineering and intrusive lady who could be a kind of pain in the neck oftentimes. So everything in their marriage was going fine. I was born in 1958, a year later, after they were married, until in 1972, my dad developed brain cancer. And this is a photograph from 1971, a year before he became sick. What happened is that at the time that he was diagnosed with brain cancer, the rivalry that had existed between my mother and grandmother then really just exploded in a way, because my mother and grandmother then began to compete over who was going to have the right to care for my dad, to make medical decisions for him, where he was going to receive treatments, what kind of treatments he would receive. And though my mom had the legal right as my dad's wife to make these decisions, my grandmother really believed that she had the emotional right to make these decisions because in her mind, she loved my dad more. And what happened is my grandmother was looking for any answer for my dad's brain cancer. And she read about an experimental treatment for cancer out in California and wanted my mom to sell our family home in New York and move the family across the country to give my dad the best chance of having, of beating the brain cancer. My mom, like all of us, had multiple family roles. She was a wife to my dad, but she was also an adult child to her own aging parents who lived nearby. She was a mother to two then teenage sons. And she said to my grandmother, no, I'm not willing to sell a house and move cross country. And my grandmother basically never forgave my mom for that. So that about a year after my dad was first diagnosed with cancer, he died, and then my grandmother blamed my mother for his death. And then they did not see each other again from the day of my dad's funeral for another 17 years until the day of my wedding. So this is a story of a family really torn apart by family caregiving, by the sadness of the caregiving, by the conflict that some comes up during the caregiving. And this is not what I want for any family. This is not what I want for any of you. And really, I grew up to be a psychologist, trying to help other families do a better job of this. What I mean by that is having other families pull together, not pull apart during family caregiving. So I want you and I want everyone I speak with to do a better job than my own family did. So if we think about, my dad died in 1973. I was 15 years old. And in 1973, there was not, the word family caregiver didn't exist in the English vocabulary. It was not what my mother did for my dad in making decisions for him, providing him with lots of hands-on care, because as he got sicker, he lost a lot of functioning. There was no word for that, and there wasn't much appreciation for that. So the doctors that my dad saw were all very focused on his care. They provided my mom with education and guidance, but I don't think any of those doctors ever said to my mom, "How are you doing?" So this is back in 1973. So I'm going to use my family story to kind of, again, trace this history of family caregiving. Before I do, the oldest family caregiver organization in the country is the Family Caregiver Alliance, which is San Francisco based, but it's also a national organization. And it was founded in 1977. And in the section on the Family Caregiver Alliance's website that talks about its history, it has this quote. At the time, 1977, professionals didn't always get the need for programs to support family caregivers. Further, for family caregiving families, exposing these personal, private issues to public scrutiny was new and uncomfortable because there was such reluctance to talk about the emotional, financial, and physical challenges of care, or because their concerns were dismissed by the very people they looked to for help. Families and caregivers often lived in isolation and suffered in silence. So what was going on, broadly in 1977 was people didn't think that they were supposed to ask for help. And by the way, there wasn't help available. And so this situation in 1977 has improved dramatically over the years with the help of Area Agency Aging for the Capital Area and Age of Central Texas and many other care organizations that serve older adults and their family caregivers, including AARP. But there are still folks in 2021 who believe the same thing that was believed in 1977, that they're not supposed to ask for things. They're not supposed to talk about family problems outside the family. And unfortunately, there's still caregivers who find themselves dismissed by the medical and social service professionals that they look to for help. So we've come a long way, but there's still too much of what's on this slide existing in the world. So I want to jump to the 1990s. So even though this picture was from August 1967, I want to tell a story of these two ladies here. So here again on the left side is my father's mother, my Nana, who, believe it or not, lived to 104 years old. And she was sharp as a tack to the age of 100. And then the last 4 years of her life, in the 1990s, she developed dementia and was eventually in a memory care unit. And so by the time she came around, and with her problems, when my aunt, who was her primary caregiver, sought help, then now the facility that she was in had someone to work specifically with caregivers. It was suddenly between the 70s and the 90s, there's beginning to be increased awareness that caregivers are important people in the lives of older adults with health problems, and that those caregivers need to be supported. And the same is true for this little old lady on the right-hand side here. This is my mother's mother, who she didn't live to 104. She only lived to 96. So, she wasn't quite as blessed, but two long-lived ladies. And my mother's mother began having mild dementia and progressed to moderate dementia in the last maybe 4 or 5 years of her life. And then what happened is she had a cerebral bleed. She had a cerebral stroke, which caused her to eventually die. But what happened during this period of time here too, there was this idea that that she was living at home. My aunt was her primary caregiver, who lived in the same apartment building. My aunt brought in home health aides that were paid for by New York City. So there were already resources beginning to be put in place in the 1990s to begin to help caregivers. So already we're on the way to helping older adults and their family members live together as families. Many of you mentioned that you're caring for loved ones with Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia or other types of dementia. And I just want to share with you that, it's been, unfortunately, the prevalence of dementia that has really driven the growth of family caregiving and the recognition of the importance of family caregiver support programs, as well as lots of research in family caregiving. So as Patty mentioned, I have a column on family caregiving that I write for the AARP website, and I have an article every month. And people post comments to the article. So I had written an article about dementia caregiving, and then a spouse of a husband with dementia put this comment underneath my article. And what she wrote is, "I don't think anyone can understand the intense, crushing isolation and loneliness of caregiving unless they have walked a mile in our shoes. I miss the intimacy we've had for more than 50 years, and I'm not talking about physical intimacy, although I miss that too. I miss having someone to talk to or share a chuckle over one of our little inside jokes. It's all gone. I'm not ready to ditch my marriage vows and dash out and have an affair, but I long to have a companion again, even someone to just stand and hold me while I cry the tears I've had to squelch and swallow for so long." So these really sad and compelling testimonials to what caregivers, particularly of dementia patients, go through has become much more common, unfortunately, as our population has aged and more Americans are dealing with dementia. It means more family members are dealing with loved ones with dementia. More of us are having this isolating, crushing experience that has been so hard. But with it has come a kind of growing public sentiment that we have to help people, family caregivers, who are going through these tough times. And so that has been the impetus for many of the improvements in caregiver support that have occurred over the last 50 years. So one other kind of landmark that I just want to mention is that there is a social psychologist at the University of Pittsburgh named Rich Schultz, who has been researching family caregivers, particularly dementia caregivers, for many years. And he had a very important article that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1999, which is the foremost medical journal. And basically what Dr. Schultz found was he studied the older spouses of loved ones with dementia and then ones who didn't have dementia. And then what he found is that the older spouses caring for loved ones, spouses with dementia, were among the most highly stressed family caregivers there were, that they had insomnia, depression, they had neck and back pain. And because they tended to neglect their own healthcare needs, they also had increased mortality. So they had their own diabetes, their own high blood pressure. And because they didn't take care of those, they died from those chronic illnesses. And when this article came out in 1999, and it really started a discussion in the public health community about what we needed to do as a society to better help family caregivers, particularly dementia caregivers. And that led in the year 2000 at that time, under the revision of the Older Americans Act. One of the last things that President Bill Clinton did on his way out of office is he created what was called the National Family Caregiver Support Program, which through the U.S. Department of Aging filtered down through the states and to the area, the local area agencies on aging, provides money and support to help family caregivers of older adults, to help them live in their own homes, in their communities. So if you're the recipient of money from your AAA to help pay for a ramp put into your house, or grab bars in your shower, or to help pay for diapers, or to run a family support group that you get to attend, it's all because of this act that was passed in the year 2000. And which, this program has grown slowly, but it's continued to grow over the past 20 years since its inception, so that more federal money is being filtered down through the states to help support family caregivers. So that's our history. Does anyone else remember these days? Is anybody old like me and can remember any of these times? If so, I'd love to see whatever you remember in the chat box, things that maybe are most striking to you. I think, those of us like myself who've been thinking about family caregivers and had a family caregiving experience over, many decades ago, it really seems like it's almost a miracle how far we've come. And yet I can tell you, and you know better than me, that this is something that caregivers need more support, that we're only part way through this journey, that we need to, as a society, particularly as an aging society, we need to do a better job of this yet. I'm not seeing anything. Whoops, here's one comment in the chat box. Lynn says, I was a home health nurse in the 80s. There were very few resources for caregivers. I saw the struggles. Yeah, Lynn, I don't doubt it. Okay, and it looks like Gailey's note was from earlier. Gailey says, my father took care of my mother after she had a stroke where she had apraxia and aphasia. My dad had bad aphasia, and I know all about aphasia. And S.C. Butler says, especially hard for men taking care of their wives. It is true. Men, and some of that is self-inflicted. Us men are pretty darn stubborn, pretty darn proud. sometimes we don't always avail ourselves of the care that and support that's available to us because we want to do it for our wives ourselves. Anyway, there's our history lesson. I hope it's encouraging in a way, but as I said, we've got a long way to go yet. So let me pick it up where we are today. So every 5 years or so, AARP and the National Alliance for Caregiving put together a survey of Americans to really get a reading on where we are as a country on how caregivers are doing. So as of the last survey that was done in 2020, at that time, it was estimated that there are 53 million Americans that engage in some form of caregiving in the course of a year. And if you compare this is about 21.3% of our population, but if you of our adult population. But if you compare this with even 5 years prior to that, in 2015, there was 18.2% of our population were engaged in caregiving. At that time, there were 43 million Americans who were caregivers. And what this really is about is that as our population ages, more older adults need care, and more families are having to step up and provide that care. So more Americans are having this experience. 1 in 5 is a lot of us adults who are providing care and having this experience and then becoming aware of just how difficult this is. Of those 53 million Americans, 60% of them are still women. When I started showing slides like this 25, 30 years ago, it was the breakdown between men and women was 70 to 30. So us men are beginning to step up a little bit. I see one comment here. Let me see if I can. Gailey says, going back to, looks like you're talking about, Gailey, I'm just kind of jumping around here a little bit. So I'm gonna come back to your comment in just a bit. About a quarter of all caregivers are young people. They're millennials. So my kids' ages in their late 20s and early 30s. About a quarter are the generation above them in the 40s, Generation Xers. But when you look at all the caregivers, those 53 million, and you boil them down to one person, it's a 49-year-old woman who's been caring for her mom for at least 4 years. She still works at least part-time. And she also has some responsibility caring for children or grandchildren. So this is the classic sandwich generation caregiver. She's being stressed by providing care for the generation above her and then for the generation below her. And she's feeling very squeezed and having a rough time. And I'll bet you that a number of you will fit that description of being that sandwich caregiver. 21% of the caregivers in this 2020 study said that their health was fair or poor, and that's in comparison to 17% of caregivers in 2015 who said their health was fair or poor, or 12% of the US population in 2020 who said their health was fair or poor. So all of this suggests that caregivers are struggling with what they're doing, and it's having an impact on them. And that there are more caregivers who are providing care are suffering health consequences than even 2015. And then I just say that all caregivers have stress. The ones that are most stressed tend to be spouses, those caring for military veterans, especially the veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. And those who are caring for loved ones with dementia. So if you are a spouse caring for a husband or wife with dementia, then you are meeting the criteria for two of the most stressed types of caregivers here, and likelihood is you're more stressed than the average caregiver. All right, so let me ask you, anything I've said so far about the history or about what's going on now that's a surprise to anybody? Any of these statistics, any of the research surprising? And you can just put your comments. I see one comment in there. Let me see what. And Jay Herndon says nothing new here. Well, what I'll tell you, Jay Herndon, is that that's usually what people say to me, that I'm telling them things that they pretty much know. You know, S.E. Butler says the 49-year-old average, and I don't know if S.E. Butler, you think that that the average would be older or younger, but it's been 48, 49 for a long time. And Irene says, no surprises here. Folks like me are working full-time as well. Folks who are balancing a job and caregiving are totally stressed. I get that. Gail Lee said, so sad that your mom had to put up with her mother-in-law trying to take over. What a stress on their marriage. For sure. You know, it made having a husband who was sick with cancer more difficult when her mother-in-law was second guessing every decision she was making and trying to take over. So I absolutely agree with you, Gail Lee. It really comes down to, you know, how do we help family members pull together and support one another as they go through this process of helping somebody they all love this person, but they just disagree on how to help this person. Okay. Jan says, is the reason that more people are caregivers now than in the past because of the aging population or the cost of care outside the home? So interesting, Jan. So I would say that the probable reason is that the population is aging. So right now, about 17% of our population is over the age of 65. By the year 2030, it's going to go up to 20% of our population will be over the age of 65. As people get older, they have a tendency to have more chronic and disabling illnesses like heart disease or stroke or cancer or dementia. And so it really is being driven by the baby boomers. So all of us baby boomers, and I include myself among them, as we age, we're driving a lot of the increased population of older adults and the increased need for family caregivers. And I just see Carol writes, it looks like 21% prevalence. We are not alone. That is for sure, Carol. There are many, many Americans who are in the midst of this experience currently or have had this experience over time and can relate to what you are going through currently. And that, I hope, means that they're more compassionate to you and that you don't feel so alone with your experience. All right, let me go forward here. So what are the keys, in my belief, kind of switching gears here, you know, from my many years as a family therapist and a clinical psychologist working with caregivers, what are the keys to caregiver self-care? Because self-care is really what makes the difference oftentimes between caregivers who thrive and caregivers who burn out and have to actually step away from their caregiving duties. And so you see 6 things here, and I'll go through them in some depth, but just to run through them very quickly, you know, we have to start with the mindset of that it's important to care for oneself. We have to deal with our own feelings. We've got to define our commitments realistically. Oftentimes we have to separate what has happened in our relationships with the person we're caring for in the past and what we're committing ourselves to now. And then we have to find positive meanings in the sacrifices that we're making. Those are all keys that we'll spend some time on. See one other comment in the box here. And Carol says, I get a lot of support from those who have walked this path before, for sure. And that's really the way it should be, right? We want people who walk this path, who know how hard it is, to not only guide us, but to you know, have our backs, to be there to support us. All right, and the last key here, it was hidden just a moment ago, is utilizing support, which, if Carol, I'm glad to hear you utilizing the support of folks who've walked this path before, but many people are reluctant to utilize support, even though places like AGE or Central Texas and, you know, AGE Aging, the capital area, have support readily available. Doesn't mean people are ready to use it. So we'll talk more about that in a second. So let's go into some of these keys in greater depth. So the first one, as I mentioned, is believing in the value of caring for yourself. Because I will tell you, this is like the biggest impediment to self-care. If you don't believe that it's worth doing, if you don't believe that you deserve to care for yourself, then you don't do it. It doesn't matter how many support groups exist in your community. It doesn't matter how many home health aides we can send to your home. If you don't believe that this is going to be helpful to you and to your care recipient, and I underscore care recipient here, then people are not going to do this. So the way I just try to convince people to practice good self-care is by using this very cliche image of the marathon metaphor. I'm sure you have all heard this. It's said a million times that caregiving is not a sprint, it's a marathon. Caregiving goes on and on and on and on. I mean, we saw that earlier from some of the comments in the box. We have people who've been caregiving over 10 years, 13 years, 14 years. That is a marathon. That is probably a much longer marathon you ever expected to run when you first started as a caregiver. So I take this metaphor and I really stretch it as far as I possibly can. So what I say is caregivers, like good marathoners, need to understand what they're getting into. Even in the early stages, they need to understand the course of the race that they're about to run. And if you're a marathoner, you learn where the uphill sections are. You learn where the downhill sections are. You don't walk the course, but you may drive the course in order to kind of see what might be particularly challenging for you. And the way caregivers do this is they find out from the doctors or from the websites. They learn about their caregiver's illness. If their loved one has a form of dementia, they'll learn about that form of dementia. If they have a stroke, they'll learn about the stroke. But they'll take the time to learn about the course of the illness in order to better prepare themselves. If you're a marathoner, you got to learn. You can't go out there sprinting the whole way. You'll never make it. You'll by the time you get a few miles into the race, you'll be completely tuckered out. You'll have to stop and maybe even go home. It'd just be too much for you. And so marathoners have to learn what pace is going to be sustainable for them over time in order to get from the beginning to the end of the race, which is what we all want to do. And the same thing is true of caregivers. What pace of caregiving is going to be sustainable over time? We can't go at caregiving as if we're running a sprint where we're putting all of our energy into it. We have to conserve energy for later. Marathoners don't run past the water station at mile 5 and when people are waving water bottles at them. No marathoner says, no, thank you, I'm not thirsty, and keeps running. It would be an insane way to run a marathon. And yet I see caregivers do something akin to that. People offer them support, particularly early on, and the caregivers say, I don't need help, I'm fine, leave me alone. You don't have to help look out for me, I've got this. Now, the problem with that is maybe at mile 5, they did have it, but by the time they get to mile 10 or mile 15 or mile 20, because they didn't replenish themselves all along the way, they are exhausted now. They just haven't taken good care of themselves. So it's important to take any and all replenishment as early in the race as you can in order to be able to run the whole length of the race. And the other last piece of the metaphor I just want to mention is marathoners run further, run better when they run alongside others, when they run in a pack. It's almost like the pack kind of picks them up and lifts them along. And I think the same is true for family caregivers, that when you are caregiving with others who are in similar boat, you're doing this shoulder to shoulder, or at least you're talking with them in support groups, you're not so alone. Being alone really undermines your resolve, undermines your energy. It's when we're with other people and they're rooting for us and we're rooting for them that we handle caregiving and run as far as we can, the best we can. So here's my marathon metaphor. You're welcome to steal that, use it as best you can. But this at least helps people begin to think about, maybe I need to take care of myself from even the first mile of the race and not wait till later when I'm starting to have some problems. We all know that there are many things that we need to do for self-care, and all of them require the belief that these things are going to be helpful. So, I asked you before, what are some of the things that you do? And many of you put things down like spiritual practices like prayer and reading the Bible and Bible study. Some of you put down physical exercise. taking some time for yourself, respite, having protected time is extremely important. And I don't think I saw anything in there about people practicing meditation or other mindfulness practices, but those two have been proven to be very helpful for anybody in a stressful situation, including caregivers. I see one other comment in the chat box. Let me take a quick peek at it. Lynn says, taking care of ourselves begins with us. We need to speak up to give ourselves enough love and respect to talk about caregiving challenges, not whining, and ask for help. Lynn, I could not say that better myself. It starts with us. It doesn't start with any agency providing services. It starts with, are we willing to do the things that we ought to do to help ourselves run this race for the whole length of the race so that we don't burn out in the process. And here's, we talk about mindfulness. We're not going to spend time talking about mindfulness today, though that is also an extremely important topic. But mindfulness is a big category of practices to help people self-reflect. It's everything from journaling to meditation to positive self-talk to finding, keeping a gratitude journal to be able to find something every day to be grateful for. So all of these kinds of practices help caregivers on a daily basis, again, if they're willing to engage in self-care. Okay, second key is accepting negative and positive feelings about caregiving. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Let me stop for a second as I see two comments in the chat box. All right. And Betsy says, for the marathon analogy, it is also important to train, such as reading caregiver literature and attending conferences. Thank you so much, Betsy. That's exactly correct. Train. I hadn't even thought of that. If you don't mind, I'm going to steal that and incorporate that into the slide for my next presentation, but you were exactly right. Training is about education, is about, learning what you need to learn to do this as well as you can. And Deborah says, what's the best approach in getting a proud father to start doing these things? Deborah, I'm almost there. We're going to get there before this presentation is done, I promise you. So hang on to that. All right. So the second one is accepting negative and positive feelings. So what does that mean? Basically, some people, either they say this question out loud or they say this question to themselves because they're ashamed to say it out loud. And that is it okay if I don't always enjoy being a caregiver? And what I always tell people, I tell caregivers this before they bring up questions like this, statements like this, is I say all caregivers have mixed feelings about the caregiving they're doing. They may love the person they're caring for, but they don't have to love all the things they're doing to care for that person. They don't have to love toileting them. They don't have to love grooming them. They don't have to love, making sure they're not that they're going to not spill soup on their shirt. There's lots of activities, caregiving activities that are just not fun. But what happens is when caregivers have those negative feelings about those activities, they feel guilty. Because they feel like, oh my God, this means I'm not being a good wife, I'm not being a good daughter. How could I not want to do these things for my loved one? And like I said, well, because sometimes those things are not so enjoyable to do and nobody wants to do them. But in any event, these caregivers feel guilty about their negative feelings and then they try to kind of almost compensate or overcompensate for the negative feelings by doubling down on making sure that they do everything they're supposed to do. And what I say is it's normal and expectable to have negative feelings. Hating caregiving is not hating your care recipient. And you got to give yourself permission to set limits on the caregiving tasks you hate. If you hate toiling, well, and I took care of my mom with dementia for 7 years. I did not like toileting her. Believe me, I didn't like toileting her. It was embarrassing for me. It was embarrassing for her. If anything I can do to get someone else to do the toiling, like with some of the home health aides, that's what I did, because it wasn't something I enjoyed, and it didn't help our relationship for me to be toileting her all the time. I see some comments in the chat. Let's take a peek. All right. Gay Lee says, my negative is difficult to admit is that my husband embarrasses me. He's so slumped over, etc. Yes, Gay Lee, embarrassment is also one of the negative feelings that people have oftentimes with loved ones who don't function the way others expect them to function in public places, for instance. And then we may keep them home because they embarrass us. And then we become more isolated and they become more isolated. And that's not good for them, for their loved ones, and it's not good for us. Melissa writes, we are human, easily frustrated. I think, Melissa, if that is completely true, we do get easily frustrated, and we are human. We have to be kind to ourselves, and compassionate towards ourselves as we would be human towards anybody. Lynn says, so true, it's been an emotional roller coaster. And Rona says, how can you combat negative feelings? And what I would say to you, Rona, is you combat them by accepting that they are normal. They are normal. If you scratch the surface of any caregiver and you get them to admit that, to really be honest with you, they will not like all that they need to do for caregiving. Nobody does. No one does. I'm going to raise my hand here and say, again, I was a caregiver during my 50s, for first my stepfather with Alzheimer's disease and with my mom with vascular dementia. It was no fun. I did it because it was important to do. I did it because they needed me to do it. I did it because it was the right thing to do, but it was not fun. It was not something that I enjoyed. It was something that had negative consequences for my marriage, negative consequences for my own relationships with my own children, took me away from work. And I did things which were hard, really hard. So if you're in that same boat, you are allowed to feel negatively. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a human being. Lynn says, be grateful for your ability to do the unpleasant tasks. The caree could have been you. I get nauseous when I have to do certain tasks, but I'm still grateful that I can do them. Yes, Lynn, there is gratitude in the ability to do things that, there but for the grace of God go I. I could have been the one who had the stroke. I could have been the one who has dementia. Maybe someday I will. But in the meantime, so long as I have the ability, it is a blessing to be able to help other people. But what you have to do to help them is not fun, is not pleasant, is something that you are allowed to feel negatively about. So I hope that gives you some sense of how to combat the negative feelings, Rona. Let me go on. Third of the 6 keys I wanted to mention is defining commitments realistically. What does that mean? Well, caregivers, I have heard them say, I feel I have to do this, but what's the right way to do it? And how much should I do? So there's a question of like, how much is enough? How much am I supposed to do to be a good son, to be a good wife? What is it, to be a caregiver? Does it mean that I give over my whole life to caregiving, or do I give over part of my life to caregiving? Am I allowed to preserve a certain part of my life for myself or for other family responsibilities, for instance? Because as I said before, most of us have multiple family responsibilities. And what I'm going to say is we have to define our commitments. We can't just say, I'll do whatever it takes, and I'll do, because even though we're committed to caring for our loved one, we don't have to always be committed to doing it ourselves. We can commit ourselves to their well-being, commit ourselves to their safety, maybe commit ourselves to keeping them at home, but that doesn't mean we have to be sitting side by side with them 24/7. And that means we are allowed to begin thinking about, what am I willing and able to do? What am I willing and able to commit myself to? But what am I not willing and able to do? Because we look at what our own individual and family circumstances are. We look at what our own resources are. Not everybody has the same resources. Not everybody's in the same family situation. When I was caregiving for my stepfather and mother, I had teenage children. Teenage children are pretty self-sufficient, but they're not entirely self-sufficient. It meant that I had to be available to do things with them and for them, just to make sure that they were doing okay. I didn't want to devote myself fully to caregiving and have them go off the rails because they were getting in trouble. So I had to be there for them, and I had to be there for my mom and stepfather. And that meant I had to find that kind of balance, I had to strike the right balance, as this conference title describes. And I had to choose consciously what I was going to do and also what I really was limited in doing. I could not work. I worked a full-time job, and it meant I had to be at work. And there were times I had the flexibility of leaving work to take my mom to the doctor, for instance, but that didn't mean I could leave work for every one of her doctor's appointments. It meant sometimes I asked my wife to take her to the doctor. Sometimes I would ask the home health aide to take her to the doctor because I couldn't be there all the time without neglecting my work duties and jeopardizing my work, my job. So there were limitations that forced me to make choices. And the best thing to do is to make those choices consciously and as wisely as we can, and to not feel guilty about having to make choices, because we all have multiple responsibilities and we have to find that balance. What I often say to caregivers is everyone has limits about what they are willing and able to do. What part of caregiving will be especially hard for you? What are your limits? And that if we delegate some of our responsibilities to other family members, or if we were fortunate enough to be able to hire someone to help out with some of the responsibilities, that's not shirking our duties. That's delegating duties. We're still ultimately responsible, but we're finding a different way of achieving the same goal of keeping our loved one at home, safe and well. And that we have to ultimately accept the compromise that we don't have to be the perfect caregiver. We only have to be the good enough caregiver. The good enough caregiver is all that people need in order to do as well as they can. We don't have to take this onto ourselves and then give up the rest of life. It's not good for us. It's not good for the rest of our families. It's not good and sometimes it may not even be good to really encourage the care receiver to become that dependent on us and only us. Anyhow, before I go on, I'm going to bet you that, oftentimes when I talk about defining commitments, people have qualms about this. They feel uncomfortable with this. Anybody have any thoughts about this you want to put in the chat box before we go on to the fourth key? Well, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box so far. Well, I see one. Okay, I'm seeing a couple. Great. Lynn says, I'm not willing to let my health go, so I talk about this with my disabled husband and take breaks. He agrees. Great. Thank you, Lynn. And the fact that you can talk about it with him makes it a lot better. The other Lynn says, I left Texas to come live with my parents in Oklahoma. As their caregiver, I feel like I'm at their beck and call. I have a hard time setting limits since I live with them. Yes, Lynn, that would be very difficult. But I will also say to you that if you're in a room, that's your room, you would have the chance to close the door to that room and have time to be in that room so that they're not at your, you're not just there at their beck and call. They don't just ring a bell and you come running, but that you have time that's your time, that's yourself, your own time. I see some other comments here. Marshall says, I really needed that defined, the not shirking part. Wow, wow, wow. Good. Glad to hear it, Marshall. I hope that that you feel better, that if you bringing somebody else into the picture, it doesn't mean you're shirking your duties. It means that you're finding a different way of getting the job done. See, let me just take another couple comments here. Loretta, very difficult to set boundaries with obsessive parent. Learned it the hard way. Keep setting boundaries. And Loretta, I would encourage you to keep setting those boundaries because it's by enforcing those boundaries that we establish new habits and make our caregiving sustainable, where we can actually finish the race. Irene says, I'm mom's sole caregiver, no one to delegate to. And Irene, I feel for you. I would also say that there are, if you don't have family care, family members who can provide care, then it may, if it's possible at all, to get support from your community, from your church, from Age of Central Texas, from area agencies and aging of the capital area, that those would be ways of delegating responsibilities as well. And Carol says, a friend advised to write down what I would not accommodate to, like pacing at night. Sounds good, Carol. I think that's right. And And there's good advice here from Lynn saying apply for AAA caregiver support program. Good idea. Okay, let me go on. Number 4, or maybe this is number 5. I think I've kind of lost track. I think I skipped one in the process here of putting the slide deck together. So we're up to number 5. And that is find positive meanings in the sacrifices that you are making. So what do I mean by that? Well, whether you think about this consciously, whether you talk about it out loud, we all choose to be a caregiver for a reason. There's a purpose to what we're doing. And so what is your purpose? Why are you making the sacrifices on behalf of your loved one that you are making? Everybody has, if you dig deep, you'll find that it's not just one purpose, it's multiple purposes. It could be, well, he took good care of me and I want to now take good care of him. It could be because I'm a religious person and this is the thing that God has placed in my life path and this is what I want to do. Is what I should do. It could be because I'm a moral person, because this makes sense. This is the thing a daughter or a wife should do. When people don't have a sense of positive meaning like that, positive sense of purpose, if they say things like, because no one else will do this, because I feel trapped and I'll feel tremendous guilt unless I do this, those aren't as compelling. They're not as positive. They're not as sustaining reasons for caregiving as the more positive reasons that I last mentioned. And so when people feel trapped by caregiving, they feel like no one else will do it, so therefore they're forced to do it, it generally leads to resentment, and the resentment makes them predisposed to burnout. So I see one comment here, or 2 comments. Let me take a quick peek of this. All right. Gay Lee said, these are the vows I made. Okay. Lynn says, I saw my mother's eyes light up when she heard live music like mariachis or singers at concerts. That became my mission each day to have her find joy. She had the best time of her life at 86. Great. Your sense of purpose, what I'm hearing, Lynn, is to bring your mother joy. And if what it takes is live music, go for it. Get her outside, get her out and go to hear some music. That's a pretty good sense of purpose to see, because when she has joy in her face, I'm sure you have joy in your face. It lights you up to see her lit up. To not have that, to feel just resentful, makes it all the more difficult. So I'll take 2 more comments and we'll go on. Rhonda says, check with the area agency on aging in your area for supports and services. Every state has one. Absolutely. Okay, let me go on. What I often ask caregivers to get at the meaning question is, I say to them, they often tell me the story of how long they've been caregiving for and what they've been doing and what it's been like for them. And then I kind of pause and I say, why do you do what you do for your loved one? Or caregivers can ask them this question themselves. Why do I do what I do for my loved one? And what the question is really asking is, what are the values underlying my choice to give care? Am I doing this out of love, out of obligation, out of morality, out of religious devotion, out of sheer joy? I mean, what is it that's compelling me to be a caregiver? And when people can identify positive answers to these questions, then I think that they better run that marathon. They better sustain themselves over time. So to give you an example of this is a client I saw many years ago. She was 60 years old at the time. Her name was Karen, and she'd been caring for her dad with Alzheimer's disease in her house for about 2 years. And she came to me because she was pretty burnt out. And I heard all about why she was caregiving. I heard about all the caregiving she was doing. And I asked her, Karen, why do you do all that you do for your dad? And she said, well, and she told a story. She said, shortly after I was pregnant, I left my husband. Then after the child was born, I decided I was going to go back with him. My parents knew it wasn't going to work. My mother kept saying, you'll go back and have another baby. And my father said to me, you can always come home. I don't care if you have 10 babies, you can always come home. He left that door open for me. And I did just that. I went back and had another baby and came back with 2 babies. And I'll never forget that. I always knew I could go home. And with this story, what Karen was telling me is that she went through tough times in her life, that her husband was not a good husband, that he would hit her, and he would, scream at her, and that her dad let her come home with her children. And he and her mom took, sheltered Karen and her children until Karen was ready to go back out on her own 2 feet again. And that was something she was always grateful for, that her father allowed her to leave a very bad marriage to be safe, and then eventually to go and have a much more successful second marriage. And she had that sense of gratitude toward her father throughout her life. And then when her dad got Alzheimer's disease, it was an opportunity for her to pay him back, to show him some of the love that he had shown her. And that meant caregiving was a kind of almost holy task for her, a noble task. It was an extremely important task for her to do for him. And to bring that positive meaning to the fore, to bring it to her awareness, helped her get through some of the tough things she had to go through every day, because she wanted to continue to provide a home for him as he had provided a home for her. One of the other ways I help people find positive meanings is by doing something I call prospective retrospection. And that is, I ask them to project themselves into the future and look back on this time in their lives. And I do that by saying, how do you think you will look back at this time in your life 5 years from now? Or I'll say, what do you think will be important to you in the future about the choices you are making now? So in other words, how are they going to judge themselves one day? Will they judge themselves as having done the right thing, or having done the wrong thing, or having made mistakes, or having tried as hard as they could? And when I ask this question of caregivers, almost every one of them say to me, I think I'm going to look back on this time as a really hard time, and I did hard things, but I'm really glad that I did them. Because once you get away from the really hard stuff, very few caregivers regret the caregiving. When they can look back on it and it's over, and then they can just be grateful for what they did, what they accomplished. They're very grateful for having been given this experience in their lives. And that there's that positive meaning again. This is a people tell me that caregiving has taught them things about who they are, has taught them very pragmatic skills about caring for people, taught them how to do transfers, taught them how to run a feeding tube, taught them, given them a sense of gratitude at being able to help other people. And when we're in the midst of it, sometimes we don't really appreciate those lessons. But when it's over and we can look back on it, yes, then we appreciate them. My stepfather died years ago. My mom died 4 years ago. And so I can look back on my time as my mom's caregiver as not an easy time at all. It was very difficult. But I'm very grateful to have done this for her. I feel like I'm a better person for having done it. And I learned an enormous amount in the process. And the last one of the keys I just want to mention is one that I'm sure you hear again and again and again. That is, you got to use all available support as early and often as you can. This is the same thing as my saying, when you're running that marathon, you go past the water station at mile 5, you grab that water bottle. It doesn't matter whether you feel thirsty or not, you grab it and you drink it. You use every available support as early and as often as you can, because that's what helps sustain you over the course of the race. And there are many types of support, and we don't have to go over all of the types of support on the slide, but this was not true. Getting back to the historical perspective, this was not true 30 years ago. We didn't have so many in-home supports. We had some, We didn't have so many out-of-home supports. The adult daycare programs were few and far between. We didn't have respite programs. There wasn't nearly as much information as exists out there. There weren't books, there weren't websites, there weren't AAAs doing this kind of work. There weren't Alzheimer's associations and Parkinson's associations supporting caregivers. And there weren't so many people willing to provide emotional support because most of Americans didn't understand what caregiving was. And there weren't that many professionals who understood it either. So there's much more support available today than existed 30 years ago, by far, if we're willing to use it. So, but here we go. But some family members experience support hesitancy. And I forget who asked earlier about how to help her father accept some help. So I would say for folks who to this day are still unwilling to accept support, I'm using the phrase support hesitancy to be kind of cute, but it's real. This is a real thing. People will say, I don't want to look like I'm shirking my duties. I don't want my wife to feel like I'm letting her down. I don't want God to think I'm letting my wife down. People feel judged. They feel judged by others. They feel judged by their higher power. They feel judged by themselves, and they're hesitant to accept support. That, again, is no way to run a marathon, in my opinion. So they say things like, I'm no family caregiver. I'm just her daughter doing what I'm supposed to do. If you don't define yourself as a family caregiver, then you don't use family caregiver support. Simple as that. And so people just say, this is what I'm supposed to do. Therefore, I don't need or I shouldn't need any help. Or they say, our family takes care of its own. Besides, no one can take care of her as well as I can. When people say to me, no one can take care of her as well as I can, know what I say? I say, you're exactly right. No one can take care of her as well as you can. But she doesn't need perfect care. She needs good enough care. And other people will do a good enough job so that when you get to do other things like go get yourself a haircut, go to the bank, go, have lunch with friends, and then you come back to the caregiving duties, you can bring fresh energy to that. When people don't accept help, it's always because accepting help feels to them disempowering and shameful. And as I said, they're afraid of their own and others' judgments. So I go back to the marathon metaphor and I just play on this metaphor again and again and again. It is not a smart or strategic way to run a marathon if you don't accept help. It's like trying to run that marathon in dress shoes without getting a water bottle along the way and without running alongside other people and just trying to gut it out. All those 24 miles, however long a real marathon is, I don't remember now, but it's just not the smartest and most strategic way or most effective way to run a marathon. If you want to be a good caregiver, if you want to be a good marathoner, then you have to accept support along the way. Okay. So I see lots of comments in the box, and I'm going to read the ones from before, and I have two other questions for you here before we wrap up. Do you already use any of these self-care strategies? And are there other self-care strategies you'd like, are there strategies here you'd like to try? Anything you saw here that makes sense to you, that would be helpful to you? So while we do that, I'm going to go, while you put in some more things, I'm going to try to catch up. Okay. All right. I see Cristelia says it was a blessing to care for both my parents. Absolutely, Cristelia. Thank you, and thank you for doing it. I'm sure, and your parents are very lucky to have had you care for them. And I'm sure it wasn't easy either. And I hope you got as much support along the way as you could to do as good a job with your parents as you could. Okay, let me go down a little further. Mike's Place at MOW helped us by providing time off from caregiving duties, great support. That's a respite. Thank you, Regina. Marathon is 26.2 miles. Perhaps you are a marathoner, Regina, and you know better than me about marathons. Faith states that she found it was very helpful to get help with Faith states that she found that it was very helpful to get help with non-caregiving things as opposed to direct help with the caregiving. It was a huge weight off of her shoulders. What a great idea. So maybe you get someone to bring meals over. Maybe you get someone to mow your lawn. Maybe you get someone to even to clean your house, you know, so that you can focus on the things that are most important to you. Betsy says, yes, I seek the support of others. Deborah says, can we get the PowerPoint to share with others? I certainly hope you can. It's certainly fine with me. And I have no doubt that Patty and Rob will share it with you. Okay. All right. Let's just very briefly talk about the future of caregiving. I mentioned that as our population ages, there are more older adults who need care and more families who have to step up and provide care. So as I said, and you can see it here on this slide, our population is going to hit over 20% of our population over 65 by the year 2030. And as you can see, it's going to stay there for a couple decades as the baby boom generation passes through these older years. It also is interesting that, and we saw this in the results of the 2020 census that just came out in the past week or two, is that our country is becoming far more racially and culturally diverse. And that means caregivers are becoming far more racially and culturally diverse. So here's a key point. Just because of the way the population is disproportionately made up of baby boomers, it's going to throw the caregiver to care receiver support ratio off very badly. So baby boomers, and I'm a baby boomer, in 2010, I was caring for my stepfather. And I was my stepfather had available to him more than 7 potential caregivers. For every one person who needed support, there were 7 people who were capable, physically capable of caring for them. But by the year 2030, as the baby boomers age, and as the younger generation, the Generation Xers and millennials are not as numerous, we're going to go to a ratio of 4 to 1. There will only be 4 caregivers for every care recipient. And then by 2050, it's going to drop to 3 to 1. This means that in the future, we're going to have more need. There's going to be few caregivers, family caregivers are going to have fewer available other relatives to help them. And they're going to have to look more to professional supports to help them. So here's my wild-eyed predictions about the future. And some of this is unfortunately based on COVID. There's already less trust in nursing homes and much less in institutional care. And there's a big push within the healthcare to help provide more care in the home. There's going to be more need for AAAs and agencies like Age of Central Texas to provide information, guidance, and care management. There's going to be more reliance on others, non-family members, to provide hands-on supports. And there's going to be greater use of technologies like digital communication and remote monitoring, and even robots to help with some of the caregiving tasks, because there's just not going to be the human hands available to help us with these tasks. The future means there's going to be more support of different types for caregivers available. But again, it comes down to if caregivers are willing to practice self-care. Self-care is still optional. Caregivers are still going to have to find ways of feeling comfortable, caring for themselves, accepting help, and taking time for themselves. So let's see, we have about 4 minutes left. I do see some other comments in the chat. Are there other thoughts, other questions that people would like to share before we wrap up for today? I realize I covered a lot of ground. What is a AAA? Thank you, Gail Lee. A AAA is an area agency on aging. So the area agency on aging on the capital area, Patty Boardy is the head of. That's one of over 600 area agencies or AAAs around the country. If you want to find the AAA in your community, you go to the website eldercare.gov. And it will, there'll be a website where you can put in your zip code and it'll tell you the AAA in your community, and which will kind of help you find out about the area agency on aging in your community. You see Rhonda here has placed her email address so you can reach out to her. If you have questions, I see some, let me just see some other last thoughts here. How best to start a conversation with an Alzheimer's mom about transitioning to a care facility for her best interest in mind may help us now suffering after 13 years as caregiver. So let me tell you, Leslie, my mom went into a nursing home at the end, as did my stepfather. And so ultimately what comes down to it is they have to, they may not ever have the insight to understand that living in a facility may be best for them and the best for you. Ultimately, you may have to make a decision for them. And it's a very tough thing to do, to have someone go into a nursing home when they don't want to go into a nursing home. But you have to believe that when you make that decision, you're doing it in their best interest when they're not able to use their best judgment for themselves. And that having them go into a nursing home is the most loving thing that you can do for them if staying at their home will present safety issues over time to them. But this is tough. And this is one of the things that your folks from Age of Central Texas and Area Agency on Aging of the capital area, as well as your Alzheimer's Association, can help with, because they help many families make this transition to a nursing home.
Barry, in the next couple minutes that we have left, there were a couple of statements and questions that people put into the chat box about guilt. One person, just as you mentioned, is feeling guilty about having to make that decision to put their loved one into a long-term care community. Another person is caring for a family member who was abusive to them. And another is feeling guilty about hindsight of looking back at some of the decisions they make and not feeling like they made the best decision. Can you very quickly address how, as caregivers, we can overcome these feelings of guilt when we know we're doing the best that we can?
Very quickly, Rob, what I would say is guilt is also normal and expectable. Guilt is another way that we love. It's not always the preferred way that we express love, but when we feel guilty that we should have done something that we didn't do, or we shouldn't have done something that we did do, that it's because we're second guessing ourselves, that we didn't do something that was maybe ideal or perfect. But just as you point out, we are working under stress. We're making the best decisions we can at the time. We can second guess ourselves later. It's always easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. That's the easiest thing in the world. But ultimately, we've got to believe that we're doing the very best that we can at any given time. And that even if we regret specific decisions that we made, that our effort as a whole helped. Our specific decisions don't make or break whether our care receiver lives well or not. It's our overall care for them, our overall love for them that matters most. So guilt unfortunately comes with this territory, and it really can be very tormenting.
Yeah, we're human beings who are caring for human beings, and we're going to have emotions wrapped up into that, especially because these are our family members, and that's natural. And to understand that and to know that up front sometimes helps make things a little bit easier. Barry, we're out of time, and I thank you so very, very much for sharing your morning with us, your expertise. We are always so much better by having you join us with these conferences, and we thank you so much for that. Marcia had asked a question about what do you do when your care receiver starts fighting and yelling and doesn't want to accept your care. Marcia, that is a perfect segue into our next session that will be at 1 o'clock. We're going to talk about those issues. And so I hope that you will all join us at 1 o'clock for our next session. We have 5 more incredible sessions coming up. Once again, this session was recorded. We're going to be posting it onto YouTube. We'll send you that link. We'll also have a link there for Barry's slides. I know someone had asked about one of the previous slides, if they could see it again. We'll make sure that we make those available to you as well. We thank you so much for spending your morning with us. We will see you again at 1 o'clock and again on Wednesday and Thursday as well. Barry, once again, thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time out from your home to come and visit with us. And we thank you for joining us, and we will see you later today. Thank you so much.